To begin our next step, we're going to need our ProStar 30 solar charge controller, our two 30 amp circuit breakers, and 2 packs of ring terminals. The first one fits 10 gauge wire and a 1/4 inch stud. The second one fits 10 gauge wire but 5/16 to 3/8 of an inch stud. Let's begin with the solar charge controller. As you can see, I've got my batteries down below on the ground, the inverter is on the shelf above, and I'm going to mount the solar charge controller right above the inverter, just high enough so that the display is easily viewable. Always mount your solar charge controller in the vertical position. To do that, I've drilled 2 mounting holes in my shelving frame, and I've got 2 wood screws that I'm going to use to secure the solar charge controller to my shelf frame. Now we're going to mount our two 30 amp circuit breakers, one on each side of the solar charge controller. Again, we'll just use a couple wood screws to mount the circuit breakers to the shelf wood frame. Now we'll mount the second one the same way, using a couple wood screws in our drill. Okay, now we have our solar charge controller and our two 30 amp circuit breakers mounted to our shelving frame. Now let's grab the 10 gauge outdoor cable that we ran from the solar panels outside into the attic, down into the garage, and let's go ahead and cut it right at the solar charge controller. Once we've cut off the excess cable, let's set it aside for the moment. Then, taking our utility knife, we're going to cut off about 10 inches of the outer skin. Again, be careful not to cut through to the two 10 gauge conductors that are beneath the outer skin. Okay, now let's remove about 1/2 inch from each end of the two 10 gauge conductors. We can use either our wire cutters or our utility knife. Okay, we've got the first one. Now let's do the second one. Okay. Now let's take the red 10 gauge wire and we're going to cut it about 2 inches above the outer skin. Go ahead and get our wire cutters. Now let's remove about 1/2 inch of insulation off of both ends of the red cable that we just cut. Again, we can do this using our wire cutters. and our utility knife. And then let's do the next piece. Now our outdoor cable coming from the solar panels has a 2-inch piece of red wire and a 10-inch piece of black wire, and then we have a single 8-inch piece of red wire as well. Now let's go ahead and grab our box of ring terminals, the ones that fit the 10 gauge wire and the 1/4 inch stud. And we're going to need 2 of them. We're going to take one of the ring terminals and insert it onto the end of the 2-inch tail of red wire coming from the outdoor cable. We're going to get our wire clippers or some pliers. We're going to go ahead and clamp it down onto the end of the wire. Make sure it's nice and tight. Pull on it just to make sure it's not loose. You can also use a hammer if you want to make sure your connection is really tight. Then we're going to put our other ring terminal on one end of our 8-inch piece of red wire that we just cut. Again, we're going to clamp down the ring terminal as tight as we can. Even use a hammer. Make sure it's nice and tight. Okay. Now we're going to take the outdoor cable coming from the solar panels that we just cut, and let's connect the red tail to the top terminal on the circuit breaker that's marked tab on the side. Go ahead and get our wrench, and we will loosen the screw. Remove the lock washer. Go ahead and insert the ring terminal. Replace the lock washer and replace the nut. And then tighten the nut back down as tight as it will go. Okay, now we're going to take our 8-inch piece of red 10 gauge wire. We're going to connect the ring terminal to the bottom terminal of the circuit breaker. Let's remove the nut and the lock washer. Insert the ring terminal in place. Replace the lock washer and the nut. And then go ahead and tighten the nut. Then we'll grab our wrench, tighten it completely until it's nice and snug. Now we're going to take the black wire from the outdoor cable and the red wire from the bottom terminal of the circuit breaker, and we're going to go over to the solar charge controller, and we're going to insert both the black and the red wire into the solar input terminals. As you can see clearly, there is a positive solar input terminal and a negative solar input terminal. The red wire coming from the bottom of the circuit breaker is going to go into the positive solar input terminal, and the black is going to go into the negative solar input terminal. Let's grab our small flathead screwdriver and loosen the terminal screws on the positive and negative solar input terminals. And let's go ahead and insert both the black wire into the negative input terminal and the red wire into the positive input terminal. Make sure there's no conductor sticking out. And then again use our small flathead screwdriver to tighten the screw terminals down. Do the same thing for the negative input terminal. Make sure they're both nice and snug. Okay, that step is complete. Let's move on to the next step. Now let's take the remaining length of outdoor cable, and we're basically going to do the same thing that we just did, except we're going to remove a little bit more of the outer skin, maybe 12 to 14 inches. Again, we'll grab our utility knife and cut off about 14 inches of the outer skin, and be careful not to cut through to the two inner conductors. Then we'll go ahead and remove about 1/2 inch of insulation from both of the red and black conductors using our wire cutters. Then we'll do the same thing at the other end. Okay, now let's go ahead and cut the red 10 gauge piece of wire with about a 2-inch tail remaining. And then we're going to remove again about 1/2 inch of insulation off the end of that 2-inch tail of red wire. Okay, now let's grab the 12-inch piece of wire. And again, remove about 1/2 inch of insulation off the other end. Now, using the same ring terminals as before, let's take 2 of them, insert one over the 2-inch piece of red wire coming from the outdoor cable. Go ahead and grab our wire cutters, clamp down nice and tightly. Use the hammer if you'd like. Make sure it's nice and tight. And we'll put the other ring terminal on the 12-inch piece of red wire. Get our wire cutters, clamp down as tight as we can. And then use our hammer. Okay. Now let's go over to our solar charge controller. And we're going to take our piece of 12-inch red wire and our piece of black wire coming from the remaining piece of outdoor cable. And we're going to go ahead and insert those both into the positive and negative battery output terminals on the solar charge controller. Taking our little flathead screwdriver, we're going to loosen the screw terminals for both the positive battery output and the negative battery output. We are not going to use the battery plus and minus sense in our application because our distance from the solar charge controller to the battery bank is less than about 6 feet. Let's go ahead and insert the red wire into the positive battery output terminal and the black wire into the negative battery output terminal. Tighten the screws down. Make sure they're nice and snug. Okay. Now we're going to loosen the bottom terminal on the circuit breaker. Remove the nut and the lock washer. And we're going to take the 2-inch tail of red wire and we're going to insert the ring terminal over the circuit breaker terminal, replace the lock washer and the nut, tighten the nut down. We'll get our wrench and tighten it down until it is nice and snug. And then we're going to take the 12-inch piece of red wire that's coming from the positive battery output and we're going to connect it to the top terminal on the circuit breaker, the terminal that is marked tab on the side. Let's remove the nut and the lock washer. We will insert the ring terminal over the circuit breaker terminal, replace the lock washer and the nut. And then tighten down with a wrench until everything is nice and snug. Okay. Now we've successfully wired the outdoor cable to circuit breaker number 1, and from circuit breaker 1 to the plus and minus on the solar input on the solar charge controller, and then from the plus and minus on the battery output to circuit breaker number 2, and from circuit breaker number 2 down to the battery bank. Now that we've run our 10 gauge outdoor cable from the second circuit breaker down to the battery bank, we're going to measure about 1.5 feet beyond the battery bank and cut off the excess cable. Go ahead and discard the extra piece, and now we're going to remove about 1.5 feet of the outer skin from this end of the 10 gauge outdoor cable. Using your utility knife, cut through again about 1.5 feet of the outer skin. Be careful not to cut through to the 2 conductors below. Okay, peel the skin back. Now let's grab our wire cutters and we're going to strip off about 1/2 inch of insulation from the end of both of our wires. Okay, let's do the next one. Then let's grab our second pack of ring terminals, the ones that fit the 10 gauge wire and the 5/16 to 3/8 inch stud. We'll go ahead and grab 2 of them. Then we're going to insert them over the top of both wires. Grab our wire cutters and clamp down. We'll use our hammer to make sure the connection is tight. Wiggle it around. Let's do the same thing for the second wire. Then hammer it down. Make sure the connection is tight. Okay, we're now ready to connect to the battery bank. Now before we connect anything to the battery bank, we're going to manually open both of our circuit breakers just as a safety precaution. We do this by pushing down the red button until the yellow tab pops open. Again, let's do this on both circuit breakers. Now let's go down to our battery bank. We have our plus 24 volts on this side and our negative on this side. Let's grab our black and red wire, and we're going to begin by connecting the black wire to the negative side of the battery bank. Let's go ahead and loosen the wing nut on one of the negative terminals. Get our black wire, insert the ring terminal, and replace the wing nut. Tighten it down. Now let's go over to the plus 24 volt side of the battery bank. Remove the wing nut. Grab our red wire. Insert the ring terminal on top. Replace the wing nut. Make sure it's nice and tight. Our battery bank is now successfully wired to our solar charge controller. Now when we reset the yellow tab on circuit breaker number 2, the solar charge controller should turn on. And there you have it. Our solar charge controller is now operating. In a few minutes, I will explain exactly what is being shown on the front panel display. Now our circuit breaker number 1 is still open, so before we reset it, let's go outside and plug our solar panels into the combiner box. Let's grab the plus and minus connectors from the first solar panel, plug them in to the combiner box. Then we'll plug in the next one. Make sure they're in nice and tight. Then we'll grab the connectors from the second solar panel, plug them in to the combiner box. Again, make sure they're nice and tight. Now there is a very good chance that the GFP device in the combiner box is in the off position, so let's go ahead and open the front panel take a look. Sure enough, it is in the off position. Let's go ahead and flip it to the on position. And let's close our combiner box. And then replace the front cover screw. Okay, let's head back into the garage.